Good afternoon, everybody in Los Angeles. It's the mid-morning, so good day to everybody. I'm Janet Halbert. I'm a member of the J Street Los Angeles chapter. I'm the co-chair of advocacy. I'd like to welcome all of you to this important conversation on striving for justice, both at home and in Israel-Palestine. It's my pleasure to introduce J Street's founder, Jeremy Ben-Ami, and Congressmember Karen Bass, who happens to be my Congress representative. And I want to tell you a little bit about Congressmember Bass. She was reelected to her 5th term, serving the 37th Congressional District in November 2018. She serves on the House Committee on Foreign Affairs and is the chair of the subcommittee on Africa, global health, global human rights, and international organizations. I don't know how you do all 4 of those, but that's pretty amazing. Thank you. Congressmember Bass also serves as the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus. And this year there are over 50 members of the caucus. Prior to being in Congress, Congressmember Bass made history when she became the 67th Speaker of the California Assembly, catapulting her to become the first African-American woman in US history to serve in our powerful state legislative role. And we were so proud of you to be in the Assembly, and we're even more thrilled to have you in Congress. Before serving as an elected official, Congressmember Bass became interested in community activism as a child, watching the civil rights movement with her father. And it was at that time that she made a lifetime commitment to participating and affecting social change in her community here locally in Los Angeles and abroad. She worked nearly a decade as a physician assistant and as a clinical instructor at USC, and that's the University of Southern California Keck School of Physician Medicine Assistant Program. And Congresswoman Bass has been an outspoken ally for criminal justice reform. One of the things I learned from Congresswoman Bass is that pregnant women who are in prison are shackled during childbirth. And one of her goals is to end that. And I thank you for taking on that cause, Congresswoman Bass. The last thing I want to say about her is in 1990, in response to the crisis that was gripping inner cities in America, which included Los Angeles's crack cocaine and gang violence issues, Congressmember Bass started and ran the Community Coalition, a community-based social justice organization in South Los Angeles that empowers residents to become involved in making a difference. We're so proud of her in Los Angeles. We're proud of her across the country and around the world. Thank you, Congresswoman Bass, for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Janet. And I just want to take a second before I turn it over to the Congresswoman to just say thank you to her for her leadership and friendship and advice over the course of these years on how to move all of our issues forward together. We're travel buddies. We traveled together to Israel, Palestine about 4 years ago. Hopefully one day we'll be able to travel again. Who knows when that time will come. Also the Congresswoman was a lead sponsor of the House resolution that passed last December calling for a two-state solution and opposing annexation, which of course is a extraordinarily relevant resolution this week with the impending July 1 deadline that I'm sure we'll discuss a little bit. But the real reason that we wanted to get together today to have a chat is because J Street is deeply committed to a set of values that inform our work, that drive us towards peace and towards justice and to fight for equality. And that applies not simply when it comes to Israel and to the Palestinian conflict and to the occupation and our desire to see equality among all people in the Middle East, but it applies here at home. And J Street is committed, even though we're a lobby focused on foreign policy and policy towards Israel and the Middle East, we're committed to speaking out on issues of justice and equality here at home as well. This is an incredible moment on all of those fronts, and we are pleased to support several pieces of legislation that are about to be considered, we hope, by the Congress. Maybe you can give us a little bit of an update. 2 of them you've introduced this past couple of weeks, the Justice and Policing Act, as well as the House Resolution 988, which condemns police brutality, racial profile, and excessive use of force. So there's a lot happening legislatively. We're happy to support you on an area we don't know that much about, but we are sure we're aligned in terms of our values, and we'd love to hear some opening thoughts from you, Congresswoman, about this moment, this incredible moment in our nation's history.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Jeremy and Janet, who I've known for many, many, many years. And I have always treasured that trip 4 years ago. That was a magnificent trip, a very powerful experience. And I do look forward to the time in which our life gets back to being normal. And maybe we would even have this discussion in person. But I think we're in an incredible moment in our country, and there's not too many times in our lifetime we see something like this, where an awful thing happens, but then a movement blossoms. And the movement, of course, that has blossomed has been one that many people have been fighting for many, many years. But I think that what happened to George Floyd was so egregious that the entire world saw his slow, torturous murder. And I think, even though it shouldn't have taken that, I think that the past videos that we've seen, they weren't as shocking as George Floyd. And I think that people just said it was enough. And what I've been excited about the movement is that it's an absolute rainbow. People of every race, every nationality, gender are out in the streets, and they're continuing to be there. And those of you that are familiar with Washington, you know it can take 20 years, 20 days, or 20 days to pass legislation. And I think because of the people out in the street, and it's over a month now that people have been out every single day, we acted and we put together a bill that we renamed last week the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. I want to talk about that in a minute, and I'll go through the key components. But let me just tell you, because I have shared this many times before, when I went to his service, George Floyd's service in Houston, and I looked up at the portrait of him, and I saw that he was born in 1973, it hit me. Because in 1973 was the year I first got involved in working on police abuse. 47 years ago. That's just me personally. This has been an issue for African Americans for hundreds of years. Generations before me have worked on this issue. Modern policing, a lot of people date back to the period of enslavement when slave patrols, when they passed the Fugitive Slave Act. And so this has been an issue in Black communities from the beginning. I remember when Rodney King was beat, that it was awful that he was beat, but those of us that have been working on these issues said, well, finally, we're sure now everybody will understand. And we were so sure that those police officers were going to be convicted, and we all know what happened. And then a few years later, cell phone cameras were invented. And you started seeing beating after beating, murder after murder, and police officers consistently got off. And so it left you with a little sense of hopelessness, but the real need to change the law. And I think that George Floyd's murder became then a catalyst for Congress to act. And so the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act has several components. One component is to hold police accountable. So right now, one of the fundamental problems with the law, or the lack of holding police accountable, is because you can't really sue a police officer because police have immunity, qualified immunity. And then if you think about that police officer, while he was murdering George Floyd, he's looking straight at the camera with his hand in his pocket with complete impunity because he didn't expect anything to happen to him. Fortunately, that's not what happened, but his boldness at that, I think, says everything. So police officers essentially are given immunity from lawsuits. Also, in order to prosecute a police officer, you have to prove willful intent, which means it was in their mind, they meant to do it. Well, how are you ever going to prove that? Which is why they always get off. So we've lowered the standard to say recklessness. Well, you don't have to be willful to be reckless. And so that will allow police officers to be prosecuted. Right now, pretty much because of work that police officers have done state by state and conservative lobbies, they pretty much only have to say that they were in fear of their life. And how do you prove that they weren't? Now, you've seen numerous videos, including the video of the man that was killed just a few days ago in Atlanta, where he's running away. Well, how could he be a danger to the police officers? But that's all the police officers had to say, is that they were in fear of their life, and then there was virtually no consequences. It was really a big deal when police officers got arrested. And we thought that was going to make a big difference, but then they never got convicted. So we take care of those two pieces in the bill, lawsuits and then also the ability to prosecute. But then we ban barbaric practices, chokeholds. If chokeholds had been banned, Eric Gardner, you remember him? I mean, his terrible crime was selling individual cigarettes. George Floyd, we don't know what his crime was, but let me, so if chokeholds were banned, he would have been alive. Duty to intervene. So we require that police officers have to intervene. You saw in that video the one guy basically acting like a lookout, holding the public back while he was being killed. The two other officers participated in his killing because they were compressing his chest. That's why all of them were arrested and charged. But our bill says you now have an obligation to intervene. You remember the video of the 75-year-old man that they pushed over? And they said he tripped and fell. I liked that because we know that the police officers lied all the time when they would beat up black people. Well, you all saw it on TV, and that was an older white guy. So you saw one of the officers reach down to render aid, and you saw another officer pull him away. In that same department a year ago, an African-American female officer intervened when a white officer had a suspect in a chokehold and she thought the suspect was going to be killed. She intervened. She got fired. So our bill requires a duty to intervene. Breonna Taylor should be 27 years old now, but they burst into her house and killed her with a no-knock warrant. So we have banned no-knock warrants in drug cases. Tamir Rice should have graduated high school this month. He would have been 18. He was murdered when he was 12 years old. The police officer stopped and within seconds shot and killed him. How threatening can a 12-year-old black boy be? Anyway, that officer had been fired from another department, but he lied on his application. So our bill calls for a national registry. That's on the accountability side. Then what we try to do is provide police departments with tools they need. So isn't it interesting that in the United States that police departments, I mean, there's no national standards for police departments. So chokehold is okay in one area and not in another area. So we think there should be national standards, accreditation, all of that. And then in addition to that, we also provide grants for community-based organizations so that they can re-envision policing. You see all the movement that is raising that now, and fundamentally what's at the core of that movement is, over time, we have divested from communities, we've shredded the safety net, and then we've left it to the police departments to pick up the pieces. So our bill provides resources so communities can figure out, maybe we need to deal with the homeless situation and put money in mental health and in housing and in supportive services rather than build a jail. So that's a summary of the bill, and any discussion you would like to have, I'm happy to engage.
Wonderful. Well, it is all unbelievably straightforward and common sense, which is what makes it so maddening that, you know, here we are, as you said, 43 years later or 47 years later, talking about how to try to get this to happen. I want to encourage folks who are joining us that you are able to ask questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom. And if you're watching us on the Facebook stream, just enter your questions into the chat and they'll be chatted to me. I know that one of the key questions that is already being asked and that I certainly have is, what do you see as the prospects if this does pass the House in the Senate, and what can we do to help get something passed in the Senate? And eventually we have to override, most likely, a presidential veto unless you can work something out with the White House. What's your sense of the strategy moving forward?
Sure. Well, who knows? I mean, with the White House, it's whatever he thinks at that particular moment. I happen to believe that if we get it past the Senate, when we get it past the Senate, he'll sign it. He wants it for his campaign.
Right.
But in the House, it is a Democratic bill. The Republicans have not come on board yet. They might. I have a bunch of calls to do. We vote on it on Thursday. But we already have the votes to pass it on the Democratic side. There's 235 Democrats. We have 231 co-sponsors, and that's no small measure because many of our Democrats are in swing districts. We won over 40 seats. So for those Democrats to stand up and vote for this bill, they are doing it because they know that it's the right thing to do, but they also know they're going to have to pay a price. The Senate is going to have a vote or not on Wednesday as to whether or not, to even have a discussion about the bill. The rules are different. In the House, it's a question of majority. In the Senate, it's a super majority. And so we will see what happens in the Senate. My guess is that the bill that Senator Scott introduced, addresses some of the areas that we do. In fact, it mimics our bill, but it doesn't have the teeth in it that we do. It doesn't have the enforcement in it. So, for example, chokeholds aren't banned, but they're studied. No knock is not banned, but we're going to gather data about it. And so hopefully there's the ability to compromise, there as well. We will see. But one thing that we feel very strong about, I feel very strong about, with people in the street every day, in every state in the country, hundreds of thousands of people have been out by now, and in countries around the world, raising the question of human rights in the United States. This is not the moment for us to do superficial change. We need transformative change, and transformative change comes from our bill. So what can J Street do to assist? J Street can put pressure on the Senate and say, take up the House bill. Do transformative change. This is not the time for smoke and mirrors.
I want to see if you would be open to shifting gears to addressing a second issue that exposes the deep structural inequities and racism in our society, which is the impact of the coronavirus and the pandemic. And, on the one hand, we are very much aware of and dealing with the raw video and the feeling of the police issues that are right in front of our face. But at the same time, you have the health side of the equation with the pandemic and the incredible inequities across different segments of society. And I'm curious, if you have some thoughts about what are some of the interrelationships and how do you begin to address the intersectional issues that all come together?
Well, thank you so much for raising that. I will tell you, I was focused full time on coronavirus.
Right, until
before George Floyd was murdered.
Yeah.
And basically what I was focused on was, as you described, the extreme disproportionate death rate. We have lost over 120,000 Americans, and I don't think the president, it has even fazed him. And so if you look out of those 120,000, first of all, the administration is making a very conscious decision to not provide the data. So we don't know the demographics, but we do know that in some areas it's 70 and 80% and 90% African American, depending on where you are talking about. This is particularly extreme in the South. In Atlanta, it was 80%, and in some of the cities, it was 90%. And then if you add in Latinos, Pacific Islanders, and Native Americans, it is huge. And so my concern is that what has been said is that, well, it's because you guys have all these health issues. You have diabetes, you have high blood pressure, you're overweight. And every time I hear that, it makes me angry because it's essentially saying there's nothing we can do right now. And I think that is a crime. I think that if the house is on fire, you send out the fire department. You don't send out a structural engineer to talk about the foundation of the house. And so consequently, we need to have interventions in those areas where you have this extreme disproportionate death rate. So that's what we were fighting for. The underlying health conditions, of course we should deal with, but not right now. Not right now. Now, why do we have the underlying health conditions? Because of systemic racism. Now, I'm so excited that we are now actually able to say that term, and people are curious as to what that means. And so what has happened before when it comes to policing and when it comes to health, it has always been what has happened in our American culture is to say it's something you did wrong. There is some reason why you got shot. There's some reason why the police killed you. We don't know what happened before the video came on. And after all, this person has a police record. What does that have to do with the fact that somebody was shot in the back? What happened to innocent until proven guilty? One of the things that has always been so painful to me personally, and I know it is to other Black people, is that when I would talk to people, people would say, well, I've never had that experience with the police. Therefore, you must not have either. Or it must have been something you did that resulted in the police treating you that way. And it's the same thing with health. Well, the reason why you guys have all these health conditions is because you don't take care of yourself. Now, the worst example of this was an emergency room physician in Ohio who happened to be a state legislator. Now, this just happened 1 or 2 weeks ago, 2 weeks ago. He's a state legislator, and he's listening and at a hearing where a Black female physician is telling him about the disproportionate death rate. The emergency room doctor says, well, is the reason why colored people have a problem is because they don't wash their hands well? I mean, that's a physician. And you wonder why there's health disparities? But what I'm excited about is that these things are being discussed now. I don't think I'm going to hear it so much anymore of not believing what my history is. And I have my own personal history with LA, with the police department. It's not just men, it's also women. I had to have that talk with my daughter as well.
And, you know, one of the things that I think we're seeing particularly in the younger Jewish community and folks who have been progressive political activists, I think, is this, you know, deep desire to find a way to be there, you know, and to be of help. And I want to just acknowledge how you have been there for the Jewish community when it comes to issues related to anti-Semitism. And, you know, we have looked to the leadership of the Congressional Black Caucus and to leadership of the African American community to stand with the Jewish community against anti-Semitism. And I just want to acknowledge deeply that it's the Jewish community's turn to now be there for you, you know, and to say, what can we do to really help here? You know, what, it isn't enough for us to just express our sympathy at this moment, right? I mean, we want to be of real help and to be able to support real change and to find ways to make it clear about these systems that are resulting in these inequalities that you're talking about.
You know what I've been so inspired by, and really I've actually been inspired by this since Trump has been in office. And you've heard me say this before, Jeremy. He brought us together. He's brought us all together in opposition to him. I mean, he's raised the level of, you know, I mean, it's in a horrible way, but it's a positive consequence in the sense that he has raised the level of consciousness around race. I mean, you look at some of the protests that are happening out there now. In some cities, there's very few Black people. It's majority white. Seeing all those white folks wear Black Lives Matter t-shirts. Because the other thing too is that happens a lot is that, and one of my white colleagues said this, and I was so glad she verbalized it so I could respond to it. She said, well, you know, as a white person, I was really told I shouldn't talk about race. That's something that, you know, Black people talk about. And I'm like, no, please don't leave the burden to us, please. And as a matter of fact, you know, and I hate to say this, but it's true, you have more credibility talking about race than I do. Because if I talk about race, it's like, well, there she goes. She's the race card. Why don't they get over it? But when white folks talk about race, it is extremely helpful, and it makes me feel like I immediately lose 20 pounds. But the Jewish community, let me say something very specifically. You know, we are now going through this soul searching over all of these racist symbols that are so painful. And I think that that is something so specific because the Jewish community understands that in ways that nobody else does. I mean, the idea, and you know, I mean, I've just been loving what Speaker Pelosi's been doing. I mean, she's just on a rampage, moving the statues and all that. I have to walk through the building that my enslaved ancestors built. And there's statues around of mass murderers, of Nazis, if you can imagine that. Because some of these people exterminated folks, and there's literally statues to them. Now, we're now learning about them, and they're all over the country. I was shocked when I came to DC. I didn't realize this until I got here. I mean, streets named after folks. And so beginning to remove those symbols is such an important thing. And the Jewish community drawing the parallel, oh my gosh, that would just be so helpful because people are making fun of it. I mean, the president on Saturday, now he chose to give a speech right next to a massacre site on the 99th anniversary. And that was an act of aggression to me. That wasn't, somebody I know in the White House said that he was tone deaf. I said, no, he isn't. That was a deliberate act of racist aggression. And I think raising the parallels would be very helpful, explaining, helping people understand the power and the pain of symbols.
And I think another aspect that's very difficult to talk about for the Jewish community in terms of parallels, but I want to raise it and see where you take the conversation. You know, the structural and systemic oppression of one people based on their race is obviously not exclusive to the United States. And we do, in fact, have issues when it comes to how Israelis and Jewish Israelis are treating Israelis of other races, and particularly those who are under occupation. And so we have seen instances in just the last month. There was a young child who was killed. It turned out that he had learning disabilities and didn't understand that there were police and that they were intervening, and he ran to try to hide, and he was killed. And by the military in that particular case. And you know, there is just an ongoing set of issues with injustice, inequality over there as well as over here. Now, I'm not suggesting that there is an exact parallel, but what I am suggesting is that when we talk about injustice somewhere, we have to talk about injustice everywhere, right? And I think sometimes the issues that we work on, even though they're over there, they're tapping into that same value set and that same core set of beliefs that we want to have in place over here, that all people should be treated equally, regardless of who they are and the color of their skin and their religion and their ethnic background. I don't know if you have any thoughts about how these issues translate to other settings around the world as well.
Well, you know what, and I think that same thing is happening in Europe because France has lots of issues and so does the UK. And it's very heartening for me to see people in both of those countries protest in solidarity with what's happening here, but it's also raising the question of their own countries, you know? And it's interesting you raise what you said about the child. I didn't know about that, but the second time I went to Israel, as a matter of fact, when we arrived in the airport, we were delayed because there was a massive protest of Israeli Ethiopians because there was an Ethiopian soldier, and if I'm not mistaken, he was in uniform, I think, and he was beat by the military, and it was a big, huge incident. And so there was this massive protest that delayed our group from getting to the hotel. And I remember we met with the Prime Minister, and right after we met with the Prime Minister, the soldier was meeting with the Prime Minister. And what it did was it raised the issue of the Israeli Ethiopians. And I think that this is a time for soul searching around the world. And, but I think it's the responsibility of the United States, since we run all around the world telling everybody about human rights. We're the ones that have to lead. And the parallel I draw is also with the civil rights movement, because what had been happening in the South for hundreds of years, really was not revealed until the press went down to the South and covered the civil rights protests. And then the world saw what was happening in the South. And it's kind of like the parallel today is the cell phone camera. And so I think that people, and I know this is a wide audience, so one of the other things that people can do, wherever you are, find out about your own police departments. Because I will bet you money, I don't care where you are in the United States, if you inquire about the arrest rate, the demographics in your area, if there are Black people that live there, it's disproportionate. And I think you can inquire about it. So it's something that we can all check into. And then we also all have to be on guard with our cell phones. You know, we do. And if you see somebody being stopped, slow up a little bit. Slow up a little bit, because even if you don't whip out your camera, if the police see you noticing and witnessing, you might save a life.
That is so important and so vital, and I've personally found myself in that situation several times, and I couldn't agree more that just our very presence there is a constraining factor on how police will behave in those situations. Do you mind if I switch gears and just ask you a foreign policy question, since we are a bunch of foreign policy nerds here at J Street, and with annexation being on the doorstep for us, I know that you are full on focused on the issues that you're dealing with on policing, et cetera. But,
I have to deal with the world too. You know,
yeah.
You got to multitask. Can't
Exactly.
just be narrow.
Well, first of all, I appreciate your signing on very early to the letter that several of your colleagues are circulating, trying to send a clear message to Prime Minister Netanyahu that this annexation is something that just should not move forward. And I'm curious what, and a lot of people in the Q&A are also curious to get your take on whether or not you think that there is enough momentum from congressional opposition. There's been 3/4 of the Democrats in the Senate. There's been Joe Biden. Pretty widespread, uniform statements from the Democratic Party here. Do you think that's enough to convey the message to the Israeli government that this is something that would harm the U.S.-Israel relationship if it moved forward?
Probably not. I think that it's got to be bipartisan. I'm not sure if I think that it has to be Republican as well. And I think, and you and I've talked about this many times, I think what has happened over the last several years, I forget the exact number, but the Republicans have been pretty successful at different times in making this a wedge issue, and trying to use Israel to break the bond that has happened over the years. And so if the Republicans don't come on board, I think that sends a very specific signal. When the Prime Minister campaigned off of Trump and made Trump a big part of his campaign, then I think the only thing that would break that is the election that's going to happen in a little over 130 days.
Right, and that has that of course is a top priority for J Street in our C4 and PAC hat. Of course, we are fully in recognition that so many things depend on the outcome of the November election. There are a number of questions in the chat that are wondering what, for instance, you mentioned Republicans and the context of Israel and annexation, but on the police bill, what are the Republican objections? What are the issues that you think will stand in the way of them joining your bill?
The interesting thing about the bill is that prior to our committee vote last week, I had a lot of conversations with police, and there's a lot of support for parts of the bill. For example, not the accountability side, the accreditation side. So I think, and then even in the hearing, this was interesting, Jeremy, because in the hearing and in the committee vote, my Republican colleagues really didn't trash the bill. They talked about everything under the sun. The only thing that didn't come up was Hillary's email. I mean, they talked about Mueller and Tifa and this and that. That to me made me feel like there has to be a lot of underlying interest and agreement, but that politically they didn't feel they could come on board. You know what I mean? And then since the president tweeted last night, usually when he tweets, that's when they, even if they want to go one direction, he tweets and that pulls them in another direction. So we'll see after I make these calls over the next few days whether or not they will be moved.
Somebody asked specifically if you could repeat the name and the number of your bill, so that people have that in order to be able to lobby their members on it. So I don't know if you happen to have the number there, but the name is the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act.
Justice and Policing Act, yes. George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. And I always forget my numbers.
So do I. So there you go. But I'm sure that people know what the bill is, the Justice and Policing Act.
It'll be the main bill we're dealing with this week.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. And, another set of questions that is coming up in here is looking for, there's some sensitivity in the Jewish community regarding some sense of anti-Semitism that at times comes in to some of the dialogue. What do you think can be done in the most productive manner to try to sensitize and to engage where there's a feeling that some rhetoric at times and some positions might have crossed a line when it comes to anti-Semitism?
Well, you know what? I'm not really sure. Like, let me give you an example. In LA, there was a few days where there was vandalism. Most of it has been peaceful, but there was anti-Semitic graffiti that was done. I don't know exactly what it was. I just heard about it, but I have no idea who's doing it. And so people asked me about it, and I honestly don't know. I don't have any reason in the world to think it came from African Americans. What I do know, though, is that I know that these protests have been infiltrated by right-wing folks. For example, there was, when we did our hearing, the Republicans brought in this African-American woman whose brother was killed in Oakland. And he was killed at the protests, or so she said. He was nearby the protests. He was a federal police officer, and he was killed. She and my Republican colleagues associated it with the protests. Well, it turned out it was a right-wing group, the Boogaloo Boys. Why they have that name, I don't know, but they arrested the guy recently. They arrested him last week. And he specifically went to the protests to kill police officers, but to make it look like it was the protesters. So I think we need to be careful right now, and we don't know who's doing certain things, and I think it would be a mistake to make assumptions. The other thing is that Black Lives Matter gets credited with all sorts of stuff. And it is not a solid, defined organization. And so that's an assumption as well. And I think it's really important to be very clear about what is happening and where it's coming from. I do know that a Black Lives Matter website and some of the original leaders of the organization have issues with Israel and have done things that people felt were anti-Semitic. But I would not make the assumption that that is what is going on now at all. I've not seen any foreign policy, anything in any of these protests.
Well, I just wanted to give you a chance. We've got a couple of minutes left here. I wanted to give you a chance to see if you wanted to give us some final wrap-up thoughts. Somebody did point out in the comments that I may not have been 100% clear that the young child who was killed is Palestinian. And I did want to make sure that that had been clarified. The issues are both issues of racism in Israeli society as in American society to people of color, but it's also people of Palestinian descent who suffer there as well. So I did want to make sure I had clarified that. And I want to give you a chance in the last couple of minutes to see if you have any closing thoughts for us.
Well, I just want to thank you. I mean, you know, J Street is always there, always on the cutting edge, and I feel tremendous amount of solidarity and really appreciate our friendship and our partnership. And we're all going through this moment together. And so to the extent that we can take advantage of this moment to raise our level of understanding about each other, and then about U.S. history, because I think that's one of our fundamental problems. We don't know much about our history. We have a tendency in our American culture, we only want to be told stories about cherry trees and nice parts of our history. A documentary I would recommend people seeing is 13, the number 13 for the 13th Amendment. Please Google and see that on Netflix. That talks a lot about systemic racism in the justice system, the origins of it. And then the other thing is that there are a number of white experts in racism, a woman that just wrote a book called White Fragility, I think. And I think that sometimes some of the best people to talk to are not necessarily African American. Although Brian Stevenson is nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize, in my opinion, but we need to take advantage of this moment. I'm very excited about this moment. I feel like we're right on the edge of maybe some significant change in our country. But the real change is going to happen in a little over 130 days. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for your leadership. Thank you for your friendship. Good luck passing this bill in the next few days. And then
I'll need it.
even better luck come November that we'll have a different change in direction in the country.
Exactly.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman. Good to be with you.
My pleasure.
Bye-bye.